The fountain at Brookstone Ridge died like something had been unplugged from the earth. Water arced beautifully for a final second, then choked into mist and silence. Sprinklers down the boulevard clicked and clicked, throwing nothing but dust. A few residents turned their heads at once, as if the whole neighborhood had just felt a pulse stop. Up the hill, past the last manicured hedge, a newly installed valve sat locked beside a small lake. And the lock wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that the person with the key had never given anyone permission to touch that shoreline. A raw trench sliced across the edge of a quiet field, still wet with clay, still marked with boot prints that didn't belong there. The soil had been peeled back fast, with the confidence of people who assumed no one would challenge them. Under the torn sod, a pale pipe ran straight as a threat. Whoever laid it had aimed it toward the creek that fed the lake, then angled it down toward the subdivision like a private shortcut through someone else's life. Mason Harrow had bought his property for the kind of quiet that doesn't need defending. He was 38, worked remotely, and liked projects with honest results, clearing brush, mending a fence line, keeping the shoreline walkable. The farmhouse was old but solid, set back from the road with trees that made the world feel farther away than it was. At the far end of his acreage sat the lake, spring-fed and steady, the water so clear on calm mornings it looked like a window cut into the land. It wasn't flashy, it was simply there, reliable, alive, and valuable in a way most people didn't notice until they needed it. Brookstone Ridge sat downhill like a different country. Fresh paint, identical mailboxes, crisp sidewalks, and a stone entrance sign that looked expensive enough to have rules carved into it. The HOA ran the place with polished certainty. Neighbors didn't argue with it, they complied with it. And for a while, Mason barely thought about them. He wasn't part of their meetings, their votes, their landscaping standards. His land ended where their perfection began. The first warning signs were small and strangely casual. Bright survey flags appeared along Mason's tree line and disappeared overnight. A pair of workers in reflective vests paced the boundary like it belonged to their route, not his deed. Trucks slowed near Mason's driveway, idling for a beat as if memorizing angles and access points. Nothing was overt enough to confront. Everything was just bold enough to irritate. Then one morning, the irritation became physical. Tire ruts bent through ferns and snapped stems. Fresh dirt scarred the field. The cut was too straight to be accidental. It had direction and purpose. Mason followed it with his eyes and felt the quiet of his property shift into something else, something contested. 2 days later, paperwork arrived with the weight of authority. A certified letter declared a community utility improvement was underway and warned that interference would trigger daily penalties. The language wasn't a request or a negotiation, it was a verdict printed in neat lines. Soon after, more envelopes followed, fine notices and violation summaries accusing Mason of obstructing community infrastructure. The audacity was almost impressive. The infrastructure was literally carved into his land, and the HOA was acting as if Mason were the trespasser. Physical pressure followed the paper. Temporary barriers Mason placed near the trench were moved. Trail cameras he set to watch the boundary vanished without a trace. A contractor dumped gravel at the edge of his driveway, narrowing the entry so tightly that Mason had to creep his truck in at an angle. Even the air seemed altered around the property line, as if the neighborhood downhill had decided the trees were no longer a boundary, just an inconvenience. The trench deepened. Stakes appeared with engineering tape. The faint chemical bite of PVC cement lingered on the breeze. And the pipe, once exposed, began to vanish under backfill, hidden fast, like a secret meant to become permanent before anyone could stop it.
Mason didn't answer intimidation with noise. He answered it with documentation. County plats came first, then old surveys, then the thick closing binder he hadn't opened since buying the place. Late at night, under a desk lamp, he moved page by page through recorded boundaries, easements, notations that most people ignore because they never expect to need them. He paid for a private surveyor to restake corners with bright caps that couldn't be misread. He photographed everything. He kept timestamps, receipts, maps. The deeper he dug into the paperwork, the clearer the truth became. There was no easement where the pipeline had been laid, no permission recorded, no legal corridor for what was happening in his field. And then he found the line that turned the whole conflict from ugly to lethal. The lake wasn't merely near his property, it was part of it, bed and banks included, with recorded control of its outflow. The creek feeding it, the outlet leaving it, the rights attached to it were tied to Mason's deed like a spine. The HOA had built a pipeline across his land, but worse than that, they had built it to reach for water they did not own. They had gambled that the source was just nature, just scenery, just something nobody controlled. The HOA escalated when Mason stopped being quiet. A heavier crew arrived and worked like they were racing daylight, pushing the line deeper, backfilling fast, leaving only a faint raised seam across the field, subtle enough to deny, permanent enough to function. Equipment staged near Mason's trees, too close and too comfortable, as if his boundary were already theirs. Mason brought in an attorney who understood land use and water rights, and the strategy snapped into focus with brutal clarity. This wasn't only trespass, it was an unpermitted utility crossing tied to a water diversion with regulatory consequences. The filings came quickly. Survey overlays showing the pipe outside any legal easement, deed language establishing lake ownership and controlled outflow, and state rules requiring permits and disclosures for water withdrawal and distribution systems. The turning point arrived not as shouting, not as drama, but as a procession of authority. A county inspector walked the trench line with a clipboard, pausing at each stake as if reading the land like a ledger. A state environmental officer photographed the intake area near the creek with the calm precision of someone who had seen this kind of shortcut before. The surveyor's stakes went into the soil like punctuation, turning assumptions into measurable fact. By afternoon, the order landed. Work stopped mid-motion. The crew backed away from the trench as if the ground itself had changed status. Near the lake, a valve that had been installed without Mason's permission was tagged, documented, and locked down under official notice. Down in Brookstone Ridge, the entrance fountain ran dry in broad daylight. People who had treated the HOA's confidence as law watched it evaporate with the last dribble of water.
Consequences arrived fast once paper authority replaced neighborhood bluster. The HOA was ordered to remove the line, restore Mason's land, and address erosion risks near the creek. What had been framed as a routine improvement became a costly public humiliation. Regulatory penalties for non-compliance, additional fines for unpermitted diversion, and a settlement that covered Mason's legal fees plus long-term repairs. The board members who had pushed the project hardest tried to rebrand it as a misunderstanding, but the record was too clean. Contractors had been approved, routing had been signed off, enforcement letters had been sent, and none of it had been backed by verified ownership or recorded permission. The confidence wasn't accidental, it was habitual. Brookstone Ridge had to switch to a metered municipal supply for common area irrigation. The cost didn't vanish into some abstract budget. It appeared in real bills, right where residents could feel it. And for the first time, the community showed up to meetings in numbers the HOA had never faced. Questions replaced slogans. Documents replaced declarations. Within a month, the old board was gone. New policies followed. Boundary work required independent verification, written permissions had to be recorded, and all utility projects needed transparent notice before a shovel touched dirt. Weeks later, grass reclaimed the scar across Mason's field. The creek ran clear again. The lake kept its steady level, indifferent to human hierarchy, reflecting the same sky it always had. Mason added a simple gate and better signage, not out of fear, but out of respect for borders, his and everyone else's. In Brookstone Ridge, the fountain eventually returned, smaller and more practical, fed by a system residents could track and pay for. From a distance, the neighborhood looked unchanged, but the culture had shifted. People started asking for proof. They stopped treating confidence as evidence. Mason never needed revenge. He only needed the truth, recorded in ink decades before anyone in that HOA had moved in. And if an association can convince itself that private land is just an obstacle to be cut through, how many other homeowners are being pressured into surrendering rights they don't even realize they have? Share what you've seen, because the next person they test might not own the lake, but they still deserve their boundary.